Frank Mitchell had always believed in the instincts of his German Shepherd, Rex. The loyal dog had been part of the family for 5 years, ever since Frank and his wife, Ellen, adopted him from a local shelter in Denver, Colorado. Rex had always been gentle, especially with children. Whether it was greeting the neighborhood kids during their evening walks or watching over their newborn son, Daniel, with quiet devotion. But something had changed. How will the story unfold? Before we get into the details, we would love to know which country you are watching from. And I would love it if you enjoyed the story and subscribed to the channel. For the past 2 weeks, every single night, Rex had stationed himself beside Daniel's crib, his ears pricked forward, his body tense. The moment darkness settled over the house, he would let out a low, steady growl, his gaze fixed on the same dimly lit corner of the nursery. At first, Frank brushed it off. Maybe Rex was just adjusting to having a baby in the house. Maybe he was just being protective. But the behavior didn't stop. It intensified. Each night, without fail, Rex stood his silent vigil, growling softly, unwavering in his focus. One evening, as Frank stood in the nursery doorway, watching Rex with growing unease, he turned to Ellen. "I don't get it," he murmured. "He's never acted like this before." Ellen, standing with her arms crossed, sighed. "Maybe he's sensing something we can't. Dogs pick up on things humans miss, right?" Frank nodded, but the explanation didn't sit well with him. He had checked the nursery multiple times. The windows were locked. The screens were intact. There were no signs of mice or squirrels sneaking into the house. Still, Rex's behavior persisted. "He's not acting aggressive," Frank observed. "It's more like he's trying to warn us about something." Ellen bit her lip. "What if something's wrong with him? Maybe we should take him to the vet." The next morning, they did just that. The veterinarian performed a thorough checkup, running tests, examining Rex's joints, his vision, even his hearing. "He's in perfect health," the vet assured them. "Sometimes dogs react to environmental changes we can't detect. Subtle noises, shifts in air pressure, even changes in temperature." That explanation made sense, but it didn't make Frank feel any better. That night, as he lay awake in bed, he heard it again, Rex's deep, rumbling growl from the nursery. Frank swung his legs over the bed, walked down the hall, and found the dog standing stiffly beside Daniel's crib, staring into that same corner. Frank followed his gaze, but saw nothing. Just the soft glow of the night light casting faint shadows against the wall. Still, Rex didn't move. A chill ran down Frank's spine. Something was off. Tomorrow, he decided, he would watch Rex more closely. Whatever was unsettling the dog, he was determined to find out. After all, Rex had never been wrong before. The first clue, the strange draft. The next morning, Frank Mitchell sat in the nursery, coffee in hand, watching Rex with the patience of a detective staking out a suspect. The dog lay relaxed in a patch of sunlight streaming through the window, his tail occasionally thumping against the hardwood floor. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, at least not during the day. Frank exhaled slowly, rubbing his temple. Maybe he was overthinking it. Maybe the veterinarian was right, and Rex was just picking up on something harmless. But still, the tension in his gut wouldn't go away. Then, in the late afternoon, things began to shift. It was subtle at first. As the golden light of the setting sun filtered through the windows, Rex's demeanor gradually changed. He lifted his head, ears twitching. His muscles stiffened. By 4 p.m., he was pacing near the nursery door, then circling back to the crib, nose twitching as if trying to catch a scent Frank couldn't perceive. And then came the growl. Low, deep, the kind that sent a chill up Frank's spine. Rex's attention, as always, was locked on that same corner of the nursery. Frank set his coffee down and moved toward the crib where baby Daniel lay sleeping peacefully, his tiny chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. Carefully, Frank reached out, running his hand along the nearby wall, feeling for anything, warmth, cold, moisture. Then he felt it, a faint, almost imperceptible draft. It was barely there, just a whisper of cool air against his fingertips. But as he stood still, focusing, he realized something odd. The draft wasn't coming from the window. It was coming from the very corner of the room that Rex had been fixated on for weeks. Frank frowned. That didn't make sense. The nursery had been fully insulated when they moved in. There weren't supposed to be any air leaks. "Ellen," he called. His wife appeared in the doorway, concern already written on her face. "What is it? Come feel this." She walked over and placed her hand against the corner. At first, she looked puzzled. Then, her eyes widened slightly. "There's a draft," she murmured. "But how?" Frank shook his head. "I don't know. But if air is getting through, that means there's a gap somewhere in the wall. Maybe it's nothing, but..." He glanced down at Rex, who was still in full alert mode, body rigid. "I'm starting to think he's been trying to tell us something all along." Ellen bit her lip. "What if we have a structural issue? A crack in the wall? Could that be what's making Rex uneasy?" Frank thought about it. Maybe, but that wouldn't explain why he only reacts at night. Ellen sighed, crossing her arms. "I don't like this, Frank. If there's something wrong with the house, we need to find out before it gets worse." Frank nodded. "Agreed. I'll call someone first thing tomorrow." That night, as Frank lay in bed, his mind raced. The house was old, built over 60 years ago, and while it had passed all the necessary inspections when they bought it, who knew what time and weather had done to the structure? But more than that, something else was nagging at him. Rex's behavior wasn't just about a cold draft. The dog wasn't afraid. He was guarding, protecting, and whatever it wasn't just a simple air leak. At midnight, unable to sleep, Frank got up and made his way to the nursery. As expected, Rex was there, standing beside the crib, growling softly at the corner. Frank crouched next to him and reached out again, pressing his palm against the wall. The draft was stronger now. Then for the first time, Frank heard something, a faint, almost undetectable sound. A whispering rush, like air moving through a narrow space. Not quite a whistle, but close. His stomach tightened. Something was behind that wall, and Rex had known all along. The unsettling signs in the nursery. Frank Mitchell sat in the nursery, heart pounding as he pressed his hand against the cool wall once more. The faint whispering sound persisted, an eerie, almost ghostly rush of air. It was too subtle for most people to notice, but Rex had sensed it all along. The German Shepherd stood stiffly beside him, ears pricked, tail low. His growl was softer tonight, but his watchful eyes never left the corner. Frank swallowed hard. This wasn't just a draft, it was something else. The next morning, Ellen returned home early from her teaching job, a concerned look on her face. "I talked to Margaret Henderson next door," she said, setting her bag down. "She's lived here for 40 years, remember? I asked her if she ever had issues with her house. Anything about leaks or cracks in the walls?" Frank raised an eyebrow. "And?" Ellen hesitated. "She told me something interesting. After last fall's big storm, she noticed water stains on her wall. The one that backs up to Daniel's nursery." Frank stiffened. "So you're telling me water's been getting in?" Ellen nodded. "It's possible. I called a home inspector. He can't come until Thursday morning, but I think we should move Daniel's crib into our room until we know what's going on." Frank ran a hand through his hair. "I don't like it, but I also don't want to ignore this. If Rex is right, and something's wrong, we need to know now." That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Rex's behavior followed its usual pattern. By late afternoon, he was restless, pacing between the nursery door and Daniel's crib. By dusk, his growling had started again, deep and steady, his eyes locked on that same cursed corner. Frank had seen enough. Determined to figure out what was behind that wall, he grabbed a stepladder and a flashlight, climbing up to examine the ceiling. Rex stayed close, watching every move. The beam of light flickered across the smooth, pale yellow paint, until Frank noticed something odd. Hairline cracks. At first, they looked harmless, but as he followed their spidery path across the ceiling, he saw they all originated from the same corner. His stomach twisted. Frank pressed his palm against the wall near the baseboard. A slight vibration hummed beneath his fingertips. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. He pulled his hand back sharply. "What is it?" Ellen asked, eyes wide. "I don't know," Frank admitted, stepping down from the ladder. "But it's not just a draft. Something's shifting in this wall." Ellen shivered, glancing at Rex, who let out a low whine. "Maybe it's a loose pipe," she suggested. "Or a structural settling?" Frank shook his head. Pipes don't cause vibrations like that. And if it were just settling, Rex wouldn't be so fixated on it. That night, they took turns staying up. Frank was on watch around midnight when he heard it again, the faint rush of air, followed by something else. A soft creaking sound. Rex, lying beside the crib, tensed immediately. His growl deepened, chest rumbling like distant thunder. Frank's pulse quickened. He grabbed his phone and recorded the noise, replaying it with headphones. There it was, a faint but distinct shifting sound like something inside the wall was settling or moving. His mind raced with possibilities: water damage, pests, loose insulation, maybe even a foundation issue. But none of those explained Rex's reaction, because whatever was behind that wall, it didn't belong there. And Rex had been warning them all along. Thursday morning couldn't come soon enough. The expert steps in, a shocking discovery. By the time Thursday morning arrived, Frank Mitchell had barely slept. Every night, the unsettling sounds behind the nursery wall had continued. The faint whisper of air, the occasional soft creak. And every night, Rex had remained at his post, growling low and steady, refusing to let his guard down. Now, as the home inspector, Tom Reynolds, stepped into the nursery, Rex stood stiffly beside Daniel's crib, watching the stranger with quiet intensity. "Looks like someone already knows there's a problem," Tom said with a chuckle, nodding toward Rex. "Dogs can be better than any equipment I have. They hear things behind walls that we never could." Frank forced a nervous laugh. "I'm counting on that." Tom got to work immediately, running his tools along the walls, measuring for irregularities and scanning for moisture. Frank and Ellen stood by, holding their breath with each new reading. Then Tom paused. "That's interesting," he muttered, pressing his palm against the corner where Rex had been fixated for weeks. Frank tensed. "What is it?" Tom pulled out a moisture meter and ran it along the baseboard. The reading spiked dramatically. "There's significant moisture buildup here," Tom confirmed. "And it's not from a leaking pipe. The problem is external." Frank felt a lump in his throat. "What do you mean?" Tom grabbed his flashlight and directed it toward the bottom edge of the baseboard, revealing a thin, dark stain. "See this? Water has been seeping into the wall cavity from outside, probably due to a faulty gutter or a crack in the foundation. My guess? Every time it rains, moisture gets trapped inside, and at night, as the temperature drops, the condensation shifts." Frank and Ellen exchanged horrified glances. Tom continued his examination, using a small tapping tool to test the wall stability. When he tapped near the corner, the sound changed hollow, almost brittle. Rex let out a sudden whine. Tom frowned. "That's not good." Without hesitation, he pulled out a small drill and made a test hole in the drywall. As the bit broke through, a sickeningly damp smell filled the room. Tom stepped back. "Yep, that confirms it." Frank swallowed hard. "Confirms what?" Tom exhaled sharply. "Your wall is rotting from the inside." Ellen gasped, clutching Daniel protectively. "The moisture has likely been sitting in there for months, maybe even longer," Tom explained. "It's breaking down the wood framing and insulation, which is why you're feeling drafts. That's also why your dog's been reacting. He's been hearing the structural weakening long before you noticed anything." Frank's stomach churned. "How bad is it?" Tom didn't sugarcoat it. "If this had gone unnoticed for another few months, the entire corner of your house could have started collapsing. This isn't just about air leaks. It's a serious structural hazard." Ellen's face paled. "Oh my God!" Frank glanced down at Rex, who had finally relaxed slightly, as if relieved someone else finally understood what he had known all along. Tom straightened. "I'll give you a full report and recommend a contractor immediately. You'll need to remove part of the wall, replace the damaged framing, and reinforce the foundation. It's not a small fix, but it's fixable, thanks to your dog." Frank knelt beside Rex, rubbing his fur. "You really saved us, buddy." Rex wagged his tail, but kept his eyes on the wall, as if making sure the danger wasn't over just yet. By the time the inspection was over, Frank and Ellen knew one thing for sure. They owed their home, and possibly their lives, to Rex's unwavering instincts. But the worst was yet to come, because when the contractors arrived and tore open the wall, what they found inside was far worse than anyone had imagined. The investigation continues, a serious threat. Frank Mitchell stood in the nursery doorway, arms crossed, heart pounding. The air smelled of damp wood and old decay. Tom Reynolds, the home inspector, had made it clear this wasn't just a small leak. Now, as the contractors arrived to begin the repairs, Frank felt the weight of an impending disaster hanging over their home. Ellen held Daniel close, standing beside Rex, who remained tense and alert, his sharp eyes fixed on the wall as if still sensing something lurking inside. The lead contractor, Mike Dawson, ran a hand over the compromised drywall and let out a low whistle. "Yeah, this is bad. We'll need to open it up completely to see the extent of the damage." Frank exhaled. "Do whatever you need to." Mike nodded to his crew. Within minutes, they began cutting away the drywall, carefully peeling back layers of rotted material. Then, the first major warning sign appeared. A section of insulation crumbled away, revealing dark, spreading mold. The smell intensified, thick and choking, sending Ellen a step back. "Oh my God," she murmured, covering her mouth. Mike frowned. "Yeah, that's toxic mold, and a lot of it. You guys are lucky your baby hasn't been breathing this in for too long." Frank felt his stomach churn. Daniel had slept in this room every night. "We need to get this out," Mike continued. "Mold this bad can cause serious health issues, especially in infants." "But that's not all." Frank braced himself. "There's more?" Mike reached into the open wall cavity with a flashlight, scanning the exposed wooden beams. He ran his hand along one of them, then gave it a slight push. The beam shifted, not just a small wobble. It moved. Frank's breath caught. "That's not supposed to happen, right?" Mike shook his head grimly. "Not at all. This entire support beam is rotted through. If it had weakened just a little more..." He didn't have to finish the sentence. Frank pictured the worst-case scenario. The beam giving way in the middle of the night, the wall collapsing, the ceiling above Daniel's crib crumbling down. Ellen tightened her grip on Daniel. "We're getting this fixed immediately." Mike exchanged a look with his crew. "This is no longer just a simple repair job. This is a structural emergency." Frank turned to Ellen, his voice firm. "We're not staying in the house until this is fixed." Ellen nodded without hesitation. Mike clapped a hand on Frank's shoulder. "Smart move. We'll reinforce this area first, but I recommend checking your foundation and other exterior walls. If water has been leaking in here, it could be happening elsewhere." Frank swallowed hard. How long would this have lasted before? Mike sighed. "A couple more months, maybe?" One bad storm, some extra weight on the roof, and this part of the house could have collapsed. Frank turned to Rex, who sat watching the entire scene unfold. The dog had known. For weeks, he had warned them. Frank crouched beside him, scratching behind his ears. "You saved us, buddy." Rex finally relaxed, wagging his tail slightly. For the first time in weeks, his guarded expression softened, as if he knew his warning had finally been understood. But as Mike and his crew continued their demolition, one thought lingered in Frank's mind. What if they hadn't listened? What if they had ignored Rex's warnings? The danger had been hiding in plain sight, and without their loyal dog's instincts, they might have never known until it was too late. The nursery restored, a safe haven once more. For the next 2 weeks, Frank Mitchell watched as every rotted beam was replaced. Every trace of toxic mold was eradicated, and every structural flaw was reinforced. Through it all, Rex Rem, the German Shepherd, no longer growled at the nursery corner, but he still patrolled the room frequently, inspecting the work with a quiet intensity that even the co. "That dog of yours is smarter than most people," joked Mike Dawson. Frank chuckled but knew there was truth to Mike's words. If it weren't for Rex, they never would have discovered the silent decay eating away at their home. By the end of the repairs, the nursery had been completely restored. New drywall, fresh paint, a reinforced support beam. The gutters had waterproofing was possible weak spot had. Now, finally, Frank and Ellen felt it was safe for Daniel to return to his nursery. That evening, they stood in the doorway, watching as the crib was carefully moved back into place. The once worrisome corner, the spot that had drawn Rex's relentless attention, was now solid, secure, and unremarkable. But as Frank placed Daniel gently into his crib, there was one final test left to pass. Rex, the dog, who had spent weeks warning them of unseen dangers, now stepped cautiously into the room. He sniffed along the baseboards, pausing near the newly repaired wall. Frank held his breath. Ellen reached for his hand. For a moment, Rex stood still, his ears flicking. His nose twitched as he took in the room one last time. Then, slowly, Rex lay down beside the crib, calm, relaxed, and at peace. Frank exhaled, finally letting go of the anxiety that had gripped him for so long. "I think that's his way of saying we're good," he murmured. Ellen smiled, kneeling beside Rex to scratch behind his ears. "You're a hero. You know that," she whispered. Rex gave a slow wag of his tail, closing his eyes as if he finally trusted that his job was done. That night, for the first time in weeks, Frank and Ellen slept soundly, without the eerie growling from the nursery, without the fear that something unseen was lurking behind the walls. The next morning, a small article appeared in the Denver Post, detailing how Rex had helped save the Mitchell family's home from a structural disaster. The story quickly spread, leading to an unexpected ripple effect in the community. Neighbors began checking their own homes. Margaret Henderson, the elderly woman next door, had an inspector come to look at her walls, only to discover early signs of the same water damage. Inspired by Rex's story, several families scheduled home inspections, uncovering small issues before they could become catastrophic. Ellen was even invited to share their experience at a pet owner's workshop, emphasizing the importance of listening to a pet's instincts. And through it all, Rex remained Daniel's silent guardian. Even as the months passed and Daniel learned to crawl, then walk, Rex was always there, standing between him and anything that could cause harm. One evening, as Frank checked on Daniel before bed, he found the toddler sitting in his crib, his tiny hands buried in Rex's thick fur. Rex, ever patient, simply wagged his tail, watching over him with quiet devotion. Frank smiled. They had been lucky, beyond lucky, because sometimes the most important warnings don't come from alarms or inspectors. They come from the unshakable instincts of a faithful companion. And Rex had been right all along. A new beginning, the loyalty of Rex. Spring had turned to summer, and life in the Mitchell household had finally settled back into a peaceful rhythm. The nursery, once a place of concern and mystery, had become a safe haven once more. Baby Daniel had grown more active, his tiny hands reaching for anything in sight as he learned to crawl and pull himself up. And through every wobbly attempt to stand, Rex was always there, his sturdy frame acting as a makeshift support for the toddler's tiny fingers. Every evening, Frank and Ellen would watch as Daniel giggled, clutching onto Rex's thick fur while the patient dog sat still, letting the baby use him for balance. It was as if Rex knew his job wasn't finished, that his duty to protect hadn't ended with the repaired nursery. One afternoon, Ellen came home carrying a framed newspaper article. Local dog saves family from hidden home disaster. The piece had been published in the Denver Post, and now Ellen wanted to keep it as a reminder of the loyalty and instincts that had saved them. She hung it on the wall near Daniel's crib, right where the danger had once lurked. Now, that space held something different, a story of trust, protection, and the unbreakable bond between a family and their dog. A special celebration for a hero. As Rex's birthday approached, Frank and Ellen decided he deserved a celebration like no other. On the evening of the small family gathering, Margaret Henderson, their elderly neighbor, arrived with a bag of homemade dog treats. Since hearing their story, she had become one of Rex's biggest admirers, frequently dropping by to check on him and Daniel. "You know," she said as she handed Ellen the treats, "I had my house checked because of what happened to you. Turns out I had some early water damage too. If it weren't for Rex, I never would have known." Frank chuckled, patting Rex's side. "Looks like you didn't just save us, buddy. You helped the whole neighborhood." That night, as the family gathered in their backyard, they set out a special dinner for Rex. Cooked chicken, carrots, and rice, his favorite meal. Daniel, still learning to form words, clapped his tiny hands in excitement. "Dogs!" he squealed. Rex, ever patient, let the toddler tug at his ears before gently licking his cheek. Ellen laughed. "I think that's his way of saying you're welcome." The lessons learned. As Frank sat back, Watching his son and his dog together, he couldn't help but reflect on everything that had happened. They had come dangerously close to disaster. Had they ignored Rex's warnings? Had they dismissed his growls as simple anxiety? The consequences could have been unthinkable. Instead, they had learned one of the most valuable lessons of their lives. Sometimes the most important warnings don't come from technology or professionals. They come from the instincts of those who love us most. Animals sense danger long before we do. All we have to do is listen. Trust isn't just something we give our pets. It's something they earn time and time again. As the sun set over Denver, Colorado, Rex stretched out on the grass, letting Daniel snuggle against his side. The baby yawned, resting his head against the warm fur, completely at peace. Frank reached down, scratching behind Rex's ears. "We'd be lost without you, buddy." Rex didn't move, but his tail thumped against the ground. A quiet, contented acknowledgement. The house was safe. The danger was gone. But one thing would never change. Rex would always be watching, always protecting, always there. And the Mitchell family would never take that for granted again.